General Hospital will reveal. As rumors about Joe's true identity began to spread throughout Port Charles, no one could have imagined the horrifying truth that was slowly coming to light. It all began with a faint, uneasy feeling that Lulu couldn't shake. While walking down a hospital corridor, she overheard two retired nurses discussing a long-forgotten baby switch that may have happened around the time Brooke Lynn gave birth. At first, Lulu tried to dismiss it as baseless gossip, but something about Lois's anxious glances, something in the way Brooke Lynn always seemed a little distant from the child she called her son, something about it all compelled Lulu to dig deeper. No one expected that Lulu, once in a deep coma, once thought to have lost everything, would be the one to unravel a devastating family tragedy. Quietly and alone, she began her investigation. She scoured old records, tracked down a retired nurse, and finally uncovered a disturbing detail. On the night Brooke Lynn gave birth, there had been a power outage in the maternity ward. In that moment of chaos, a baby had been swapped, and no one had noticed. The child now called Gio, the one everyone believed to be Brooke Lynn and Dante's son, was in fact not the baby Brooke Lynn had delivered. Gio was someone else's child, innocent, misplaced into a family that wasn't his, all due to a scheme whose architect remained unknown. Lulu's discovery shook her to the core. She couldn't ignore the puzzle pieces any longer. She obtained a DNA sample from Gio, discreetly comparing it to a strand of Brooke Lynn's hair saved from shortly after childbirth. When the results returned, it was as if her world crumbled beneath her. There was no genetic connection. Gio wasn't their child. He was a stranger, a victim of an unspeakable act that had torn him from his biological family without anyone knowing. The revelation sent Lulu reeling. If Gio wasn't Brooke Lynn's son, then where was the real child? Where was the baby that Brooke Lynn had carried for 9 months? That child, born in chaos, had vanished, out there somewhere, lost in the world, possibly living a life of uncertainty or hardship. The thought of a baby being taken from its mother in such a sacred moment, robbed of its identity, robbed of love, was too much for Lulu to bear. And yet, she knew she was the only one who could carry the weight of this truth, at least for now. She was paralyzed by fear. Not fear for herself, but fear of the devastation this truth would unleash. Brooke Lynn, already fragile, would break. Dante, always steady, always believing, would be gutted by the betrayal of fate. Lois might never forgive herself. And Gio, an innocent boy, would be cast into a whirlwind of confusion and heartbreak. Lulu, caught in the middle, held this unbearable secret like a ticking bomb in her chest. Night after night, Lulu sat in silence, staring through the hospital window into the dark, asking herself the same questions over and over. Who would do something so cruel? Was it a deranged doctor with a twisted agenda? A family enemy seeking revenge? Or, more chilling still, someone within their own circle, someone who knew the truth but buried it for reasons yet unknown? This was no longer just about a baby swap. This was the beginning of a mystery far more dangerous and far-reaching. Lulu didn't know if she had the strength to see it through, but she knew this: the truth, no matter how painful, had to come out. If it didn't, the wound it created would fester forever in the hearts of everyone it touched. And though terrified, Lulu also knew she would soon have to make a choice, one that could change everything, before it was too late. When Brooke Lynn learned the truth, she could no longer hold herself together, her mind shattered in a moment that came without warning. Her world, built upon moments of love, every sacrifice made to be a good mother, every effort to protect the family she believed was hers, collapsed without mercy. The horrific truth, that Gio was not her son, not the child she had cherished with every breath, not the baby she had cradled through sleepless nights, struck like a blade of ice driven deep into her heart, ripping apart everything she once believed to be sacred and unbreakable. She wept silently, trembling in a despair too profound for words. Every sweet memory now became a nightmare. The keepsake photos, the tiny outfits she once chose so carefully for Gio, the echo of his innocent laughter in the hallways of their home, all became cruel reminders that she had lived inside a long, painful illusion. Brooke Lynn felt betrayed, not only by fate but by herself, for not sensing, not suspecting, even once, that the boy she raised was not truly hers. Dante, too, could not maintain his usual calm. He, who prided himself on being a present and protective father, now felt as if he'd been living in a beautiful lie. The moments spent teaching Gio to kick a soccer ball, the bedtime stories, the proud talks about fatherhood, all suddenly felt hollow. A deep guilt gnawed at him every second. He didn't know how to face Brooklyn, and even more terrifyingly, he didn't know how to face Gio, a child who had done nothing wrong, yet now represented a devastating truth. And yet, no one suffered more than Lulu. She was the one who uncovered it all, yet she was also the one consumed by the darkness it unleashed. Lulu never intended for this. She wasn't someone who thrived on destruction. But instinct, love, and a growing unease had pushed her to chase the truth. Now, as that truth stood naked in the light, it was Lulu who bore the heaviest emotional burden. Her pain wasn't just for Brooklyn and Dante. It was for the real child, their biological son or daughter, who was now lost, out in the world, their life a complete mystery. They could be suffering, unloved, even abused, and no one would know. The thought of a child ripped from their mother's arms in the most sacred moment of life, forced to grow up in a foreign place with no knowledge of their origins, haunted Lulu's every waking hour. And though she was only the messenger, the guilt of uncovering such a cruel reality weighed down on her like a stone. What crushed Lulu most, though, was the look in Joe's eyes, pure, trusting, and filled with love. It once warmed her heart, making her feel like a proud aunt. But now, each time she looked at him, it was like falling into a void of guilt. She couldn't see him without feeling like she had stolen something from him, his identity, his sense of belonging, even if unintentionally. She wanted to embrace him like she used to, comfort and protect him, but she couldn't. Not when the bond between them had been exposed as a lie, and the space between them widened into an emotional chasm. Lulu now lived in constant fear, that one wrong word, one misstep, would cause everything to implode. The family was already fractured by this truth, and even though she hadn't caused the tragedy, she stood at the center of its aftermath, unable to escape. She didn't know whether anyone in the family would ever forgive her. She didn't know if Brooklyn could ever look at her again with trust, or if Dante could ever confide in her without pain. But the one thing she did know was this: no matter how painful the truth was, she couldn't unlearn it, and she couldn't bury it. The cost of truth was high, but the cost of silence was even higher. So Lulu, torn between loyalty and fear, would have to learn how to keep walking forward, step by step. Each one cutting her like broken glass beneath her feet, knowing that the road ahead held no promises of healing, only the hope that somehow, someday, they might find the child who was truly theirs, and begin to mend what had been so cruelly torn apart. No one in Port Charles could say for certain who orchestrated the baby switch on that fateful night, when Brooklyn endured the pain of childbirth amid chaos, and the destinies of two innocent infants were forever altered. The silence that had lasted for years was finally broken, but the mastermind remained like a ghost, unseen, cold, and calculating. Rumors began to spread like wildfire, each person with their own theory, their own suspicion, their own unshakable fear. Some believed the culprit was a former doctor at the hospital, a man who had long shown signs of mental instability and was quietly dismissed after a series of bizarre incidents. They suspected that he had taken advantage of the power outage that night to carry out a twisted experiment for personal, possibly deranged, reasons. Others were convinced it was part of a larger, calculated scheme, an act of revenge by a hidden enemy with a vendetta against either the Falconeri family or the powerful Quartermaines, intending to inflict pain by tearing them apart from within. And then there were those who whispered the unthinkable, that Lois might have known. That perhaps she had discovered the truth long ago but chose to remain silent, either out of fear, or to protect Brooklyn from a devastating blow. If that were true, was her silence born of love? Or was there something even darker that she was hiding? Each theory led only to more questions, casting a heavy and suffocating shadow over the entire family. The emergence of the truth sent shockwaves throughout Port Charles. This wasn't just a family scandal, it was a threat to the entire community. People began to question, if one child could be switched at birth and no one noticed for years, how many others might have suffered the same fate? Fear and doubt spread. Parents demanded the hospital conduct reviews of birth records, run DNA tests, and investigate every birth connected to the staff who had been on duty that night. The hospital launched a large-scale internal audit, reviewing personnel files, pulling old security logs, and even contacting former employees for questioning. Grainy surveillance footage, incomplete medical reports, and a series of strange coincidences began to form a tangled web. Each new clue raised more uncertainty. Even the police were brought in, though they too found themselves overwhelmed by the magnitude and complexity of the case. Port Charles, once a peaceful town, was now suffocating beneath a cloud of suspicion and unease. At the center of the storm was Gio. The boy who had known nothing but love and safety, now suddenly sensing that the world he had trusted was slipping away. He couldn't understand why the hugs were slower, why the once bright eyes around him now looked away in silence. He didn't hear the hushed conversations behind closed doors, but he felt the shift in the air, the way love seemed to retreat into silence. He felt colder, more alone, as if he no longer truly belonged. Gio could only sense one undeniable truth: the people who had once loved him, those who had called him son, grandchild, family, were now slowly pulling away, as if shielding him from a secret he wasn't allowed to know. Their eyes, still soft and familiar, now carried hints of guilt and hesitation. Though no one had told him outright, Gio was beginning to understand that something was wrong, something that was changing everything he had ever known about his life. Lulu was no longer just the woman who had once fought her way out of a deep coma to reclaim her life. Now, she was staring down a truth far more devastating than any physical pain she had ever endured, a truth that had the potential to unravel everything for the people she loved most. The revelation that Gio was not the biological son of Brooklyn and Dante wasn't merely a personal shock, it was a destructive force threatening to tear apart the very foundation of a family built on trust and affection. She held in her hands a secret too enormous to carry, one that, if fully revealed, could bring the entire house of cards crashing down. She stood at a crossroads where neither path promised peace. If she chose to keep digging into the past to find the child who had been switched at birth, the one who truly belonged to Brooklyn and Dante, she would risk inflicting deeper wounds, triggering grief and chaos that might never heal. But if she chose to stay silent, she would live forever with the guilt of allowing an innocent child to grow up under false pretenses while the rightful child remained lost, unloved, and unknown in some distant, unfamiliar world. This wasn't just about moral obligation, it was a tormenting struggle between her heart and her mind, between empathy and fear. Lulu was torn apart by hundreds of thoughts each day. She wondered, could Brooklyn survive another earth-shattering truth? Could Dante, who had loved Gio with every fiber of his being, endure one more betrayal from fate? And what about Gio? Would he be strong enough to process the truth, to accept that the life he had known was never truly his? She knew there was no turning back. Once the truth was out, nothing could ever go back to the way it was. That alone made her feel more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. She couldn't share this weight with anyone, not yet. To do so would be to drag them into the storm with her. So she bore the burden in silence, quietly, and alone. The nights became unbearable. Lulu would often lie awake, drenched in cold sweat, haunted by visions of what might come. Brooklyn collapsing in devastation, unable to breathe through the sobs. Dante walking away in silence, unable to look her in the eyes. Gio, sitting alone in a dark room, confused and broken, overhearing someone telling him he wasn't who he thought he was. Worst of all, she imagined the switched child, out there somewhere, possibly living a life of hardship or neglect, robbed of their identity and the love that was meant for them. With each passing day, the feeling that she was being watched grew stronger. Lulu couldn't tell if it was paranoia or reality, but she was certain that someone, somewhere, was keeping tabs on her. Sometimes it was a strange car parked outside her building for too many nights in a row. Sometimes it was a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. Once, she awoke to find her window slightly ajar, though she was sure she had locked it. The signs were subtle, but they added up to a terrifying realization: whoever orchestrated the switch might still be out there, and they might be willing to do anything to silence her. She understood, with a clarity that chilled her to the bone, that the closer she got to the truth, the more danger she was in. She could vanish. She could be made to look like an accident. One day, someone could simply make her disappear, and no one would ever know why. But despite the fear gripping her heart, Lulu refused to stop. Many would argue she should walk away, that the truth wasn't worth the price of her life. But for Lulu, the greater tragedy was to let a child live a lie, and another child remain forever lost. That was something she simply could not live with. Even if the perpetrator lurked in the shadows, even if her loved ones turned their backs on her, even if loneliness and fear became her daily companions, Lulu had already made her choice. One night, she stood before the hospital, the very place where it had all begun. The cold wind sliced against her skin like knives, but inside her, a fire burned brighter than ever. She knew the road ahead would be paved with pain, betrayal, and possibly loss. But if forced to choose between silence and justice, between false peace and painful truth, Lulu would rather be the one who suffered than allow innocent lives to be stolen forever. And so, with a deep breath, she turned from the glowing hospital lights and stepped back into the shadows, carrying the flame of truth she had sworn to protect, knowing full well that her journey was only beginning.